Pure, paralyzing terror slammed into Amara's chest the moment the vault's heavy steel hinges shrieked open. "I know you have been looking for the Black Book." Dewanshik's voice echoed from the shadows, a low, terrifying calm that swallowed the remaining air in the room. He stepped completely inside, the heavy steel door clicking shut behind him. "I have known since the second week." A fraction of a second earlier, Amara's fingers had been tracing the cool leather of the very ledger, and the breathless, profound joy of finally holding a decade's worth of Choi family corruption had just started to bloom in her chest like something long overdue. But at the metallic groan of the door, her hands, meticulously trained to be the steadiest in the art restoration world, hands that could hold a sable brush against a 500-year-old canvas without a tremor, completely betrayed her. The heavy book caught on the gilded frame of a 17th-century canvas, slipping from her fingers and hitting the marble floor with a deafening thud that rang off every cold surface in the room. She froze. The damning evidence lay exposed under the harsh security lights. No time to retrieve it, nowhere to conceal it. She raised her eyes slowly to meet the terrifyingly unreadable gaze of the man she had married on purpose. Welcome back, Drama Dolls. Grab your tea and hit subscribe, because today we are diving into a mess of dynastic proportions. To understand how it all blew up in that vault, we have to go back 10 years. 10 years is a long time to carry a wound without letting it show. Amara Robinson had been carrying hers since she was 22. Since the afternoon she came home from a graduate seminar on Flemish oil techniques to find her mother sitting at the kitchen table with her hands folded around a cold cup of tea and an expression on her face that Amara had never seen before and has never been able to fully name since. Not grief exactly, though grief came later. Something earlier than grief, the expression of a person who has just understood that the ground they were standing on was never actually ground at all. The Choi Dynasty's lawyers had been thorough, and they had been fast, and they had left her mother with a business that had been gutted so completely that even the shell of it was worth nothing. And they had done it through a chain of holding companies and fraudulent licensing agreements so tangled that no lawyer Amara's mother could afford had been able to find the thread to pull. Amara had found the thread. It had taken 7 years of working her way into the elite circles of Seoul's art world, of restoring paintings for the families who collected them, of being present and observant and unhurried in the rooms where powerful people said things they did not expect to be remembered, of building a reputation so immaculate that when the Choi family needed someone to refine their rough, newly acquired air before he embarrassed them at international functions, her name was the one that arrived on the recommendation list as though it had been waiting there all along. She had put it there herself. Through 3 careful referrals and 2 years of patience, she had walked into the introductory meeting with Choi Lee. The patriarch, 67 years old, silver-haired, with the particular polished brutality of a man who had spent 4 decades making decisions about other people's lives from rooms they were not invited into. And she had been everything the meeting required her to be: refined, accomplished, deferential in the way that powerful men found reassuring rather than weak. She had accepted the terms of the arrangement with the measured composure of a woman making a considered professional decision, and she had felt, underneath the composure, the cold, focused burn of 10 years arriving at their destination. The arrangement was this: Amara would marry Choi Won-shik, the illegitimate son, acquired from an orphanage at 24 when the legitimate heir proved unfit and the dynasty needed a replacement. And in exchange, she would receive the salary of a senior consultant, accommodation in the Choi family mansion, and access to the estate's considerable private art collection for her professional work. The family received a wife for their rough-edged heir, a veneer of respectability for a man they had plucked from institutional obscurity and thrust into the machinery of inheritance without preparation or warmth. She had shaken Choi Lee's hand. She had felt nothing. One shik was not what she had prepared for. This was the first complication, and it arrived within 48 hours of moving into the mansion, a vast, cold house in the hills north of the city, all stone floors and high ceilings and rooms that had been furnished for display rather than habitation. The kind of house that communicated wealth without communicating any particular interest in the people who lived inside it. She had expected bitter. She had been briefed on difficult. The patriarch's assistant had used the word challenging 3 times in 2 sentences, which Amara had correctly decoded as a warning, and she had prepared herself for a man whose displacement and resentment had curdled into something she would be able to manage at a professional remove. What she encountered instead was a man who said very little and noticed everything. He did not attempt conversation beyond what was necessary. He did not perform warmth or attempt to establish a domestic normalcy that neither of them had asked for. He moved through the mansion with the unhurried self-possession of someone who had learned long ago that silence was not a social failure, but a form of judgment, that the right thing to say was worth waiting for, and that filling the air with noise was something other people did. He rose early and left for the company before she came down for coffee, and he returned late, and the mansion held them both at a measured distance that she had planned for, and that he seemed to require for his own reasons rather than as a response to hers. The first gesture arrived on the 4th morning. She came down to her studio, the room off the east gallery where she had set up her restoration work, a long table under north-facing windows, the smell of turpentine and linseed oil, already establishing itself as the room's primary character, and found a cup of tea on the corner of the work table. It was still steaming. The particular shade of amber told her it had been steeped for exactly the right amount of time, which meant he had made it after watching her make it, which meant he had been paying attention. She stood in the doorway looking at the cup for a long moment. She sat down and drank it and said nothing about it, and neither did he. The second gesture was the hinge. Her restoration workbox, a beautiful, battered thing of walnut and brass fittings that had belonged to her grandmother, had a broken hinge on the left lid, a small failure she had been managing with a folded piece of leather tucked under the corner. She came down one morning to find the hinge replaced, the repair so precise that if she had not known to look for it, she would have assumed the box had always been this way. The brass of the new fitting matched the patina of the old one so closely that she looked at it for a full minute, trying to understand how he had achieved it. She did not ask, but she began to look at him differently. Not with warmth. She would not permit warmth. Not yet. Not while the black book was still unfound, and her mother's face across a cold cup of tea was still the image she returned to when she needed to remember why she was here, but with a different quality of attention. The attention of a restorer who has looked at a painting she assumed was a copy and has begun to suspect it might be original. She began leaving things. A plate of food outside his home office when he worked past dinner. A book, a specific kind of technical text on structural engineering, which she had noticed him reading and had sourced a better edition of through her professional contacts, left on the hall table where he would find it without it being an offering he had to receive directly. Small, anonymous acts of attention that required no acknowledgement and received none, and that slowly, without either of them announcing it, transformed the temperature of the house from cold to something that was at least not actively hostile. She was blurring her own lines, and she knew it. She kept going. The family dinner happened on a Thursday. The dining room of the Choi family's formal residence, a different house from the mansion, larger, more deliberately imposing, smelled of hothouse flowers and the particular, faintly suffocating warmth of a room where the heating was kept high enough to suggest luxury rather than comfort, Choi Lee sat at the head of the table with the easy authority of a man who had been the most powerful person in every room he had entered for 40 years, and the table was spread with the food and the crystal and the linen of a household that communicated its status through objects, because the people inside it had long since run out of other things to offer each other. Won-shik sat to Choi Lee's left, with the composure of someone who had learned to prepare for these evenings the way soldiers prepared for known engagements, with a specific internal bracing that left no visible trace on the surface. It was not enough. It was never enough. Choi Lee began with the company, with the quarterly figures and the board dynamics and the international partnerships that Won-shik had been managing for 8 months. And then, with the practiced, almost leisurely cruelty of a man who understood exactly where the nerve endings were, he pivoted. He spoke about Won-shik's origins the way he might speak about a project that had underperformed, analytically without heat, which was worse than heat because it denied the subject even the dignity of being worth anger. He referenced the orphanage by its district name. He used the word acquisition in relation to a human being, without appearing to notice that he had done so. Won-shik's hand, resting on the table, went very still. Amara, watching from across the white expanse of the tablecloth, felt something move through her that she had not planned for and had no immediate professional category for. A hot, sudden thing, arriving before she could assess it, the sensation of witnessing something being done to someone that should not be done to anyone, and finding that the witness position was no longer available to her. She reached under the table. She found his hand, his fingers, initially rigid with the restraint of a man holding himself in place through sheer force of will, registered her touch the way a person registers something unexpected in the dark, with a fractional pause, a slight catch, and then, slowly, his hand turned and held hers back, not dramatically, with the quiet, enormous effort of someone accepting help they did not know how to ask for. Choi Lee continued talking. Amara held Won-shik's hand under the tablecloth and looked at the patriarch across the crystal and the hothouse flowers, and felt the cold, focused burn of 10 years crystallize into something that was no longer purely strategic. Later that night, alone in her bedroom at the far end of the hall, she sat on the edge of the bed in the dark and rebuilt every wall she had let slip. Her mother, the kitchen table, the cold cup of tea, the lawyers and the holding companies, and the thread she had spent 7 years finding. She was here for a reason. The reason had not changed. Won-shik was gentle and observant and had held her hand under a table because he had no one else who would, and none of it, changed what she had to do. She lay down in the dark and looked at the ceiling and told herself this was still manageable. The vault was 3 levels below the gallery wing, accessed through a service corridor that Amara had been mapping for 4 months, making excuses to extend her work hours, cataloging the patterns of the security staff with the patient, granular attention of someone who had spent years studying the surfaces of things in order to understand what lay beneath them. She had found the black diary on a Thursday, late enough that the house was empty of staff, the corridor silent except for the ambient hum of the climate control system maintaining the temperature required to preserve oil on canvas. The vault was large and cold and smelled of metal and old paper and the particular preserved darkness of a room that held things that were not supposed to be looked at. Her hands found the book before her eyes fully adjusted to the security lighting. The leather was cool and smooth and worn at the corners, and the moment she felt it, the moment her fingers closed around the spine of a decade's worth of everything she had come here for, she felt the joy of it bloom in her chest, pure and particular and entirely unburdened by anything she had not yet allowed herself to feel. And then the hinges shrieked, and then the door clicked shut. And then his voice arrived from the shadows like something that had been waiting for a long time to be said. I know you have been looking for the black book. I have known since the second week. She raised her eyes to his. He was standing in front of the closed vault door, not moving toward her, not threatening, simply present, his dark coat still on from wherever he had come from tonight, his hands at his sides. The security lighting was harsh and white, and it made the shadows on his face deeper than they were, and he looked at her across the marble floor in the fallen diary with an expression she had learned to read across months of small gestures and careful silence. Not anger, which was what she had braced for, but something more complicated and more honest. He had known. He had known since the second week, and he had left tea outside her studio and replaced the hinge on her workbox and held her hand under his father's tablecloth, and he had known. "Say it," she said. Her voice came out flat because flat was the only register available to her at this particular moment. He crossed the vault. He did not pick up the diary. He crouched beside it, and he looked at it for a long moment, and then he looked at her. "My mother," he said, "was 23 years old when Choi Lee decided she was inconvenient. She had a son he had not planned for, and a willingness to speak about it that he found threatening, and he had the resources and the contacts to make both of those problems disappear in ways that left no official record." He paused. The climate control hummed. The orphanage had files. The files had gaps where records had been removed. I have spent 8 years trying to find what was removed and why. He looked at the diary on the floor. That book has the why. Amara looked at him. The man she had married on purpose, the man she had been using as an instrument of a plan she had designed before she knew he existed. "Your mother," she said, and the sentence did not complete itself the way she had intended because something in her throat had changed, and she stood in the cold vault with the evidence of 10 years at her feet and looked at the man across from her and understood with the full, irreversible clarity of a restorer who has finally seen beneath the overpainting to the original work beneath that she had not been the only person in this marriage who was hiding an agenda. She had been hiding it from the wrong person. Won-shik looked at her. "Your mother's business," he said. "The licensing agreements, the holding companies. I found the thread 18 months before you did, and I traced it to the same place you did, and I could not move alone because alone I had nothing that any court would take seriously." He paused. "I needed someone who could get inside this house." She looked at him. "I recommended your name to my father's assistant," he said. The silence in the vault was the deepest she had ever stood inside. "You arranged the arrangement," she said. "We arranged it," he said. "We just did not know we were working together." It took them 6 weeks. 6 weeks of working in the vault after the house had gone dark, the diary open. Between them on the cold marble floor, cross-referencing the ledger entries against Amara's 7 years of documented art world transactions and Won-shik's 8 years of corporate paper trails and the combined intelligence of 2 people who had been building toward this from opposite directions and had arrived, finally, at the same coordinates. The picture that assembled itself was comprehensive and irrefutable and damning in the way of things that have been concealed not through subtlety, but through the assumption that no one would ever care enough to look. Choi Lee had been using the dynasty's art acquisition program to launder funds from a constellation of fraudulent investment vehicles for over 15 years, the paintings moving through auction houses and private sales in a pattern that left no obvious trace, but that was, when you knew what to look for, as legible as a signature. Amara could read it the way she read overpainting, the legitimate surface applied deliberately over the original, the brushwork slightly wrong in ways that only someone who had spent a career looking at the real thing would catch. Won-shik could read the corporate layer, The holding companies, the board proxies, the shell vehicles nested inside each other like a set of boxes designed to ensure that even if you opened the outermost one, the innermost was still sealed. They opened all of them. The night they finished, the night the documentation was complete and organized and packaged for the investigators and the lawyers who would receive it the following morning. They sat on the cold marble floor of the vault with the diary closed between them and the harsh security lighting overhead and said nothing for a long time. "Your mother," Wonshik said finally, and the sentence had the weight of something that had been waiting to be said. "She's alive," Amara said. "She's well. She rebuilt what she could." A pause. "She doesn't know I'm here." He looked at her. "She will know what happened," he said. "When it's done, she will know it was you." Amara looked at the closed diary, at her own hands resting on the marble floor beside it. Steady now, the trained steadiness of years of careful work returned. The trembling of the first night resolved into something that felt, even to her own assessment, like resolution rather than suppression. "What happens to you?" she said. "When the dynasty falls, you lose the position, the inheritance, everything they gave you." "They gave me nothing," he said without heat, without self-pity, the flat, accurate statement of a man who had examined the gift thoroughly and found the mechanism inside it. "They acquired me. They used me. They seated me at tables and had their patriarch explain my origins to dinner guests and called it family." He paused. "I will lose things I never had. That is not the same as a loss." She looked at him, at this man across the cold marble floor, this man she had chosen as an instrument and who had been choosing her back, who had left tea by her studio door and fixed the hinge on her grandmother's workbox and held her hand under a tablecloth when she had nothing to offer him but the warmth of a hand, and she had offered it anyway, instinctively, from somewhere below the plan. "I'm sorry," she said, "for the plan, for using you." He held her gaze. "I used you first," he said. The corner of her mouth moved. Something released in her chest, not dramatically, not with the pressure of a long-held breath finally expelled, but gently, the way a wound released when it had been properly attended to and had finally, after a long time, decided to close. "We used each other," she said. "We did," he agreed. And then, more quietly, and then we didn't. The morning the Choi Dynasty's accounts were frozen, Choi Lee was in a board meeting on the 14th floor of a glass tower in Gangnam, and the news arrived not through the usual channels of corporate crisis, but through 6 separate simultaneous notifications on 6 separate devices, each one carrying a different arm of the same comprehensive, irrefutable body of evidence that had been delivered to the Financial Crimes Authority. 3 investigative journalists, the board's independent ethics committee, the art world's international authentication body, and the prosecutor's office before the business day began. Amara and Wonshik were in the gallery wing of the mansion when the calls started coming. They sat side by side at a restoration table, the long table under the north-facing windows, the smell of turpentine and linseed oil around them. And they did not monitor the calls or the notifications or the unfolding of the thing they had built. They sat in the quiet and the morning light, and Wonshik drank the tea he had made for both of them. And Amara looked at a painting she had been restoring for 2 months, a 17th century portrait of a woman whose identity had been obscured under later overpainting, and whose original face she had been carefully, patiently, month by month revealing. And she set down her brush and looked at it for a long time. The woman in the painting looked back, clear-eyed, restored, entirely herself. "It's done?" Wonshik said. "Yes," she said. He was looking at the painting too. "What will you do?" he said. "Now that you don't need to be here." The question landed in the room and sat between them, patient, without urgency, in the way that real questions sat, not demanding an answer, but creating the space one would eventually move into. Amara looked at her hands on the restoration table, at the grandmother's workbox with its repaired hinge, sitting at the corner of the table where it had been since she moved in, at the window with its north light falling in the particular, even way she had arranged her work to take advantage of, and the garden beyond it going gold in the morning, and the silence of a house that had held them both at a distance for months, and had gradually, without announcement, become something else. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I have not thought past this moment. I spent 10 years thinking toward it, and I stopped the thinking at the edge of it, as though the space beyond it didn't exist." He was quiet for a moment. "The space beyond it exists," he said. She looked at him. "I would like—" He stopped. Started again, more carefully, with the considered precision of a man who had learned to wait for the right sentence rather than fill the silence with the wrong one. "I would like you to remain. Not because it is practical, not because leaving would require logistical resolution, because the house is different when you're in it. Because I have been watching you work in this room for months, and I understand, now that I know the full truth of why you were here, that what I was watching was not a performance. It was you." He looked at the painting on the table. "The whole of you. Even the parts you were hiding." She looked at him for a long time. At this man who had been an instrument she had chosen, and who had turned, across months of small gestures and vault floors and tablecloths and cold tea and the hinge of a walnut workbox, into something she had no professional vocabulary for and had stopped trying to find one. "I will remain," she said, not with ceremony, not with the weight of a declaration, with the simplicity of a true thing stated plainly, which was, she had come to understand, the only way he would have accepted it. The mansion was quiet that night. The house that had held them at opposite ends of the hall for months, her bedroom door at one end, his at the other, the corridor between them measuring the exact distance of everything they had been performing for each other and for themselves, was quiet in the deep, particular way of a space after a long tension has finally resolved. The heating moved through the rooms. The garden settled into its nighttime sounds. The north-facing window of her studio held the dark and the stars. Amara stood in the corridor. She looked at her bedroom door. She looked at the length of the hall. She walked past her own door. His room was at the far end. A door she had never opened, a space she had registered as his without curiosity or invitation. She raised her hand. She knocked once, and the sound of it was very small in the large house, and the door opened almost immediately, as though he had been awake, as though he had been waiting without assuming. He looked at her. He looked at her for a long time with the unhurried, full attention that had been the first thing she noticed about him and the last thing she had expected. She said nothing. He stepped back from the door and she walked in. The room was warmer than the corridor. The lamp on the bedside table threw a low, amber light. Not the harsh white of the security vault, not the cold overhead of formal rooms, but something gentler and more honest, the kind of light a person chose for themselves in the private hours. The bed was wide, and the blankets were dark, and the room smelled of him. Of the cedar in his wardrobe and something clean underneath it, the smell of a person rather than a performance. She sat on the edge of the bed. He sat beside her. They did not speak. There was nothing left that required speech. The vault floor and the diary and the years of parallel approaching had said everything that needed precede this, and what remained was not a conversation, but a settling. The profound, physical relief of two people who have been holding themselves at a calculated distance finally, with full knowledge and full choice, letting the distance go. She lay down. He lay beside her. The amber light stayed on for a while, and then one of them, she did not know which of them, it did not matter, reached for the lamp and the room went dark, and outside the mansion the city continued its indifferent, luminous life, entirely unaware of what had quietly, permanently resolved itself in the darkness of a room at the end of a hall. Amara Robinson had spent 10 years becoming someone capable of this plan. She had not once considered that executing it would require her to become someone different. Someone who held a hand under a tablecloth on instinct, who noticed the particular amber of a steeped cup of tea, who looked at a man across a cold marble floor and understood that the damage done to him was the same shape as the damage done to her, cut from the same cloth by the same hands, and that the most precise act of restoration available to either of them was this, simply this, in the dark, in the warmth, together. She breathed in. She closed her eyes. And for the first time in 10 years, Amara Robinson slept without a plan. So, drama dolls, when did you catch on? The workbox hinge, the hand under the table, or when she walked past her own door? Let me know below and comment. Hit subscribe if you're new here, and I'll see you in the next one.